Republicans in the Senate are at odds with their colleagues in the House. Threats of a government shutdown from House conservatives are getting a chilly reception from those in the Senate. This as they try to temper expectations for what GOP priorities they can achieve amid a looming deadline.
The House has just 11 days left to pass a stopgap measure to prevent a shutdown. But some hardline conservatives have been embracing the possibility as they look to turn up the pressure on spending discussions, despite when they were in power adding $7.8 trillion to the deficit.
Here's top Senate leaders, Republican Mitch McConnell and Democrat Chuck Schumer on the matter. Let's watch.
This month, of course, Congress needs to address our nation's most pressing needs with timely appropriations, and we need to keep the lights on come October 1st.
But there is one clear place to begin. Keep the government open. As we all know, government funding is set to expire on September 30th. By the end of this month, the House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans, all must get on the same page about keeping the government open and avoiding a pointless shutdown. A shutdown that will hurt just about every single American.
Here with us to discuss is the Hill's congressional reporter, Mychael Schnell. Welcome, Michael. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So I'm not surprised that this issue is popping up again. This was something that was brought up quite a bit in that first GOP primary debate. A lot of people on that stage talking about the national debt. There's definitely an appetite among Republicans to try to cut spending. With this particular set of negotiations, what is it that the Republicans on the House side, the conservatives rather on the House side, are asking for?
Yeah, look, essentially, Amber, since the beginning of when we started talking about this appropriations process, these conservatives, particularly ones in the House Freedom Caucus, have been pushing for spending levels to be brought back to pre-COVID levels. It's a $1.47 trillion number that they have been floating around since the beginning of this process. And so in terms of that, there was in the debt limit deal struck earlier this year, there were spending caps that were placed in that bill that would essentially set fiscal spending for the next set spending levels for the next fiscal year. So the Senate went ahead and marked up its bills in line with that debt limit deal. The only problem is the House, in an effort to appease those conservative demands, went at far lower levels. And look, now we see conservatives continuing to push for more spending cuts and for lower spending levels. And it's a real problem up here on Capitol Hill because there's no consensus. And of course, that September 30th deadline is fast approaching.
So what is the Senate GOP hesitation here? Is it just the political unpopularity of a shutdown?
Well, look, I think that nobody loves the idea of a shutdown, right? Senator Lisa Murkowski, she spoke about how crab fishermen had to start their season late back 4 years ago when there was that month-long government shutdown. It's not an ideal situation. But on the other side of the coin, House conservatives see that this as sort of a leverage point. Funding has to be passed by the end of the fiscal year, or else there is this risk of a shutdown, of course. So conservatives see that as a leverage point for them, that because this is essentially a must-pass measure, they can use it to their advantage by pushing for these policy concessions, grandstand, and have a larger chance of actually getting these concessions from leadership and from Democrats. But look, on the Senate side, lawmakers essentially just want to get a stopgap funding bill over the finish line, keep the government open, and then continue with this appropriations process ahead of that kick down deadline. Because there's sort of this on January 1st, if all 12 appropriation bills are not passed, in the debt limit bill, there was written in a 1% cut across the board. So if all 12 appropriations bills are not passed by January 1st, then there'll be a 1% cut across the board. Lawmakers are using that as a threat to get their act together and get the job done before then. But look, there's a lot to do, throughout the next few months.
Hey, Michael, as a Democrat, this is sort of like the problem that we had with negotiating a debt ceiling deal at all. The debt ceiling isn't a budget negotiating tool. It's a credit card that you pay off, right? This is where you have those discussions. Now, it seems like our point in last spring when we were negotiating spending was that in 2011, when we negotiated a debt ceiling deal over spending, Republicans went back on their word and they blew through the caps when they got a Republican president and had no problem breaking the deals. So are they breaking another, are they trying to break another deal and blow through the caps that they agreed to set in place last spring?
Well, look, the fact of the matter is that those caps that were set in the debt limit deal, that was a product of a negotiation between Speaker McCarthy and between President Biden. But now, so in a way, your question is a bit complicated because some members of the Freedom Caucus, there were a handful of members actually, who did not support that debt limit deal. So essentially, they didn't agree to it. But then when you talk about subcommittee chairs marking up bills at levels that are lower than the caps there, McCarthy giving the blessing to mark up the levels below the caps, definitionally speaking, yes, they are not going in line with that deal that was struck. But of course, I mean, that was whether or not you take it, if sometimes politics reigns supreme here. And I don't think that there's any expectation that the bills at the lower levels are going to be the ones that are signed into law. This is all part of the process, right? For example, it's similar to what we saw with the debt limit. You saw House Republicans pass a very, very, very conservative bill, the Limit, Save, Grow Act. And then you saw that was a negotiating tactic to say this is everything that we want and then try to get something closer to that. So I think that we may be seeing a similar negotiating tactic now with the House passing bills of everything they hope to see. The Senate will do their own thing, and then they'll see both chambers conference and come to some sort of consensus. But look, they want to put forward their wish list, so I think that's essentially what we're seeing happen right now.
I saw some of the House Republicans also arguing on their social media accounts that the government shutdown isn't that big of a deal because the government shut down various parts of American society during COVID, whether it was the economy or churches or other civic institutions. How is that argument resonating? Are they convincing anyone else in the caucus? Are they convincing the public? I just haven't heard that argument yet in regards to government shutdown and its popularity.
Yeah, look, the lawmakers were rather not pushing, but flirting with this idea of a government shutdown, saying that they would be content with the government shutdown. It's a very small minority in the House Republican Conference. Even Speaker Kevin McCarthy has said that the government is not going to shut down. Nobody wants to see this. It's a small number of lawmakers, conservatives, really hardline conservatives, some of whom are in the House Freedom Caucus, people like Bob Good, someone like Ralph Norman. I spoke to Norman on the phone last month, and he told me that if a shutdown means that we will stop the country from continuing on its current spending trajectory, he said, so be it, right? So the people who are okay with a potential shutdown, it's definitely not the majority of the party. Like I said, it's a very minority group of the party. And that's why I think that it wasn't so surprising that we see Senate Republican senators throwing cold water on this and saying that they don't like that theory, because even someone like Kevin McCarthy would say the same thing, because he is pushing to keep the government open. He has said that he wants to see a continuing resolution passed at the end of the month. So to answer your question, the people who are pushing for a shutdown or would be content with a shutdown, it's a very small minority in the House Republican Conference, and that idea isn't picking up wide steam yet.
Well, it's also just rich coming from Republicans who added $8 trillion to the national debt when they had power and when President Trump was in office. But Michael, I wanted to ask you where we stand so far on adding a Ukraine supplemental to the spending package.
Yeah, look, this is going to be a really, really big question when the House reconvenes next week. So essentially, just for some context, the White House last month unveiled a $40 billion supplemental request. $24 billion included in that request was for aid for Ukraine. And of course, as we've seen over the past few months, there's a handful of House Republicans who are apprehensive to continue supporting Ukraine as it battles against Russia. This has been a growing movement within the House Republican Conference, and there were some amendment votes to the NDAA in the spring, over the summer, that were voted on, and about 70 House Republicans actually voted to cut off aid for Ukraine. So again, it's still a minority within the conference, but it's a noticeable group. So when you talk about this supplemental, the White House unveiled the supplemental, assuming that it would be attached to a continuing resolution at the end of the month. But it doesn't seem like the entire supplemental is going to get in there. Senators, both Republicans and Democrats, They want to see the full supplemental, which also includes disaster relief, which is important amid, wildfires this summer, hurricanes this summer. Senators want to see the full supplemental on the continuing resolution. But again, you have those House Republicans who will not be okay with sending more aid to Ukraine. So there was some reporting yesterday, Punchbowl News, Bloomberg reported that McCarthy's considering attaching disaster funding to the continuing resolution and then potentially dealing with the matter of Ukraine funding later on and potentially coupling that with some border security provisions. Whether or not that would fly with House Republicans remains to be seen. It's going to be a question we ask all of them come next week when they come back to Washington. But in terms of the status of that Ukraine money, it's still up in the air because it's such a controversial topic within the House. It's controversial within the House GOP conference, and then there are stark differences when you compare the House to the Senate. So that's still up in the air, but no doubt it'll be a big topic of conversation this month.
Definitely, especially as we see American support for aid to Ukraine sort of waning as well. Mychael Schnell, congressional reporter for The Hill, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.